Good afternoon. I am David Kerp, an associate professor at Ohio University and a fellow of our Contemporary History Institute at OU. And I've been invited by our director, Dr. Ingo Trauschweitzer, to do a short presentation on Polish perspectives on the current Russo Ukrainian crisis. And I want to look at a number of distinct ways that Poland contributes important perspectives, but also creates important problems in relation to this crisis. First of all, the Polish perspective on Russian intentions is quite important. Polish Russian relations have been complicated, if not tortured, for hundreds of years of conflict with relatively brief periods of cooperation. Interestingly, given our topic, a major element in Russo Polish conflict has been strategic competition for influence and control of Eastern Europe, particularly Ukraine and Ukrainian spaces. These conflicts began in the 16th and 17th centuries and carried on from there. By 1945, it had appeared that Poland had definitively lost this conflict. The Polish state was crushed by World War II, resurrected as a pro Soviet satellite state, and Poles were moved out of most territories in what was to become Ukraine after 1945. However, in the last decades of the 20th century, the Soviet Union itself lost control of Ukrainian spaces. And after 1989, many Polish politicians determined that the Russian failures to hold on to Ukraine were an important element in Polish reason of state, that it was to Poland's advantage, to the advantage of all the peoples of Central and Eastern Europe, that Russia be kept clear of Ukraine. So that's one thing to keep in mind, that there has been a long history of Polish competition with Russia over Ukraine, but Poles, particularly policymakers, soldiers, diplomats, strategic analysts, had come to accept that Ukrainian independence was in the best interest of Poland and Polish freedom, as well as the freedom of other peoples in the region. Another thing to keep in mind is that very early on, by the mid 1990s, those same Polish analysts had come to detect a reassertion of Russian imperialism throughout former Soviet spaces. That even though in 1989 to 91, there was initially real hope and real effort on the part of Poles to embrace Russia, to accept that it would be possible to put Russo Polish relations on a new footing, moving away from conflict to collaboration. That started to give way by the mid 1990s to a realization that Russian imperial agendas were reasserting itself within circles of power and authority within Russia. And Poles have been essentially trying to garner attention to that perspective and raise alarms about growing Russian imperialism for much of for over 20 years, largely without success, I would add. So that's one thing to keep in mind. There is a distinct tension between Russia and Poland that has deep historical roots. One of the ways it manifested itself in the early 21st century was over American proposals for missile defense. I'll talk about the American perspective shortly. But from the Polish perspective, there was initially a good deal of reluctance to participate in an American sponsored missile shield in Central Europe, even granting that, and the US tried to address this with the Russians. The missile shield's primary focus was to deter any potential Iranian attack on Europe. Russians argued that any significant missile defenses in Poland or the Czech Republic, which was another possible location, were completely unacceptable to the Russian side. So much so that Russia threatened military action against Poland should Poles consent to that. to the development of a missile shield on their territory. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Not only have there been Polish concerns about Russian imperial assertion, Russia has in the past and has made gestures since 2007, 2008 to continue to threaten Poland quite overtly. Another thing to keep in mind is the Polish perspective on the Ukrainian crisis. Poles and Ukrainians have an equally tortured and uneven relationship to that of Poland and Russia. What makes the Polish Ukrainian case especially interesting is the degree to which Ukraine has often been in the past an object of Polish imperial agendas in Eastern Europe. And in many ways, the Ukrainian national movement developed to a significant degree in opposition to this Polish agenda. Polish Ukrainian relations were further um, estranged by the conflicts during World War II, in particular, the Wołyńska Rzeź, the Volhynian massacres, where Polish nationalists working in collaboration with Nazi Germany. Now, again, not because Polish nationalists were Nazis themselves, so they had pronounced fascistic tendencies, but primarily to achieve their own Ukrainian objectives, which were ethnically pure spaces where the considerable Polish minority living in Western Ukraine would not become a means by which Poland could extend influence back there. So the Volhynian massacres involved the Polish nationalist organization, the UPA, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, engaging in ethnic cleansing, which involved a great deal of mass killing. From anywhere from 50 to 100,000 Poles died. And hundreds of thousands of more Poles fled to what became the remainder of Poland after the war. And they brought with them these stories of horrific criminality on the part of Ukrainians. Now, the Polish forces regionally, the Home Army, also engaged in defensive actions that included counter massacres. There were war crimes on all sides in a particularly lawless region during World War II, but Poles remembered and were encouraged to remember by a communist government dominated by Moscow that had its own agenda to regard Ukrainians as a particularly dangerous and hostile people. That has given way in the past 20 or so years, in part due to important people to people contacts, as Ukrainians have been moving into Poland, particularly in the last 7 years, as you have a significant Ukrainian diaspora, in part fleeing the fighting from their homeland initiated by the Russian invasions in 2014, 2015, and Russian sponsored conflict on their territory. The Ukrainian diaspora in Poland has been, for the most part, accepted legally by the Polish government, which has a reputation of opposing immigration, especially from the Middle East, but in regards to Ukraine has actually encouraged immigration. So there's a more complicated story to Polish attitudes towards immigration than is often told um, in Western media. And Ukrainians living and working in Poland have sought to influence Polish and Western policy in relation to their homeland. Finally, there's another crisis within the crisis, and that is how the West collaborates with Poland and other countries regionally, both within European Union and NATO structures, as well as outside those structures like Ukraine, to deal with increasing Russian regional ambitions. Germany is another country with whom Poland has a long and complicated history. German initiatives over the past several decades have been aiming toward reaching out to Putin's Russia in spite of increased provocations on the part of the Russian Federation towards not just towards countries in former Soviet spaces that are outside of the EU and NATO, but even towards countries like the Baltic states or Poland and Romania that are within EU and NATO structures. The Germans have their own perspectives, but also interest on these issues that at times clash with proclaimed EU values about democracy and sovereignty. And Poles have and what's interesting is Poles across the political spectrum recognize that Russian predation is a regional, if not broadly European problem, and have had a difficult time collaborating with Germany that, for the most part, seems bent on a policy of appeasement and has been for over 20 years. But that also brings to the fore the fact that it's not just a German or a French problem with the EU trying to accommodate itself to Russian ambitions, but also the United States has had difficulty formulating what American policy ought to be in the region. For much of the last 20 or 30 years, American governments have alternated in their approach to Russia, on the whole, trying to reach out to the Russians and bring Russia within the fold of Western nations. And this at times has wrong-footed Polish positions, even when the West has sought and the United States has sought Polish collaboration. In reference to the missile shield I mentioned at the beginning, the Bush administration had initially pursued the policy of a missile shield in Europe, primarily to defend against Iran. And there was a great deal of Polish and especially Czech reluctance to embrace that. It was only until after the Russian invasion of Georgia in the summer of 2008 that you saw Poland finally turn around and be willing to accept US bases in Poland to build a missile defense system. When President Obama won that election, ostensibly American policy was still to go forward. President Obama had asserted this in the fall of 2009 in a speech he gave at Prague, that the US was committed to developing a missile shield. But very shortly thereafter, um, on September 17th, 2009, the Obama administration announced that it would cease trying to develop a missile shield. This was a particularly bad day to announce it. September 17th, 2009 was actually the 70th um, anniversary of the joint Russian Soviet Nazi actions in the invasion of Poland at the beginning of World War II. And so nothing could illustrate more completely the ham-handedness of American policy in its efforts to appease Russia as making this announcement at the time. So what I want to suggest is, in Poland, we have a an ally that is very keenly aware of regional peculiarities and difficulties. The Poles have been paying close attention not just to their own concerns, but to the concerns of other countries inside and outside of the EU. Poland has not fit very well into Western policy. Currently, the concern is that the law and justice government in Poland is too conservative, but even quite progressive and pro-European, pro-integrationist parties in Poland have pursued similar policies to very little effect. And so we're looking at a variety of crises in dealing with Russian challenges in Ukraine. Poland is an important prism through which we can view those crises, but also have a sense of what is, and especially what is not working in our assessment of them. Thank you very much, and I hope this presentation has provided some insight, some help in understanding a very complicated set of problems.